The babysitter's heart raced as she sat quietly in the living room, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen the only sound breaking the otherwise suffocating silence. The house, normally filled with the laughter and chatter of children, felt empty tonight. The kids had been tucked in an hour ago, their soft breathing a constant reminder that they were still in the house, tucked safely away from whatever lingered in the shadows. She tried to focus on the TV, flipping aimlessly through the channels, but the flickering images did little to calm her nerves. Her mind kept returning to the uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. It had all started when the parents had left, offering their usual polite warnings about not answering the door for anyone and making sure to lock all the windows. They'd said it all with a reassuring smile, and she'd nodded, eager to make a few extra bucks. Babysitting was supposed to be easy, right? A way to make money while watching TV and looking after a couple of kids. But now, sitting alone in the dark house, she wasn't so sure. Her eyes drifted toward the stairs. The staircase, usually bustling with the sounds of kids running up and down, now seemed to stretch into an abyss. She didn't like being here after dark. There was something about the old wood, the way it creaked and groaned underfoot, that felt like it had a life of its own. A life that was very much present in the house, whether she could see it or not. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. It was getting late. She had no reason to be scared. The parents had only been gone for an hour, and she had already done her due diligence, checked the doors, made sure the kids were asleep, and locked up tight. Everything was fine. But still, she couldn't get rid of the creeping sensation that someone, or something, was watching her. A sudden, soft noise from upstairs made her jump. She froze, holding her breath. It sounded like footsteps, light, but unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced toward the stairs again, her eyes wide. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, maybe the wind, or the house settling. But there it was again. This time, the sound was clearer, more deliberate, like someone was walking slowly, carefully, just above her head. Her pulse quickened. The kids were in bed, she had checked. She swallowed, trying to calm herself, but it wasn't working. The house was too quiet. She was alone. She had to be. But what if she wasn't? The footsteps continued. She could hear them with every tick of the clock, the sounds echoing in her ears. She tried to tell herself it was normal, that it was just the old house, or maybe the settling of the wooden beams, but there was a nagging doubt that wouldn't let go. Slowly, she rose from the couch, her eyes locked on the stairs as she made her way toward the kitchen. Maybe it was the kids, maybe one of them had woken up. But no, the house was eerily still. Too still. As she reached for the kitchen light, a sharp, sudden thud from upstairs made her flinch. It was so loud that it seemed to rattle the walls. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was someone in the house? A burglar? It was ridiculous, she told herself. The family was well off, but they weren't so rich that anyone would want to rob them. And besides, who would rob a house that clearly had kids inside? But the sound came again. This time, it was closer. Louder. She stood frozen, staring at the stairs as if waiting for someone, to appear. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, to get out of the house, but she couldn't. The kids were asleep upstairs. She had to check on them, make sure they were safe. She had no choice. With shaky hands, she grabbed her phone from the counter, her fingers trembling as she tried to dial the parents. The line clicked once. Twice. Then, nothing. The phone went dead. Her breath hitched in her chest. What was happening? Why couldn't she get through? Her mind raced. Maybe it was just a glitch. Maybe she had hit the wrong number. But then the phone buzzed once more. The sound was faint, like static, and her heart leapt into her throat as she heard something else. A whisper. It was soft at first, a barely audible murmur that sent a chill down her spine. She pressed the phone closer to her ear, her eyes darting around the darkened kitchen. The whispering grew louder, the words indistinguishable but undeniably real. She swallowed hard, trying to calm herself, but all she could think was, where are the parents? Then another sound. A sharp, scraping noise from the hallway. It was so loud that it seemed to fill the entire house. She spun around, eyes wide in terror. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and shifting in unnatural ways, and for a moment, she thought she saw someone, standing at the end of the hall. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her mind was racing now. This isn't real. This isn't happening. She told herself that over and over, but the fear gnawed at her insides, growing stronger with every passing second. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But she couldn't. She had to protect the kids. That was why she was here. She had to stay calm. Her gaze flicked toward the stairs again, and for the first time that night, she felt her body move without her control. She was already halfway up the stairs before she realized what she was doing. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of the house itself was pressing down on her. The stairs creaked beneath her, each noise seeming to echo through the house, magnifying the dread that churned in her stomach. At the top of the stairs, she paused. The hallway stretched before her, dark and silent. The door to the children's room was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from the crack. The whispering had stopped, but her mind still buzzed with the sound. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She reached for the door, her hand shaking as she pushed it open, and there, in the bed, the children slept peacefully, just as she had left them. They were fine. Everything was fine. She sighed in relief, the tension in her chest slowly starting to loosen. But then, from the corner of the room, she heard something she hadn't noticed before. The closet door was slightly open, the faintest sliver of blackness visible beyond it. She didn't remember leaving it like that. She didn't remember anyone going near it. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly stepped toward the closet. The house groaned again, louder this time, as if it were alive, watching her. She reached out for the door, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. The darkness behind it seemed to draw her in, pulling her forward, a magnetic force she couldn't escape. When she opened the door, her heart stopped. Nothing. Just the empty space behind it. She stared for a long moment, willing her mind to make sense of the scene. But as she turned to leave, she caught sight of something on the floor, barely visible in the dim light. A handprint. Cold, slimy, and very much real. The babysitter's fingers trembled as she closed the door to the children's room behind her. The sight of the handprint on the closet floor still lingered in her mind like a haunting image, but she tried to push it aside. She had to stay calm. She had to get through the night. The kids were fine, asleep in their beds, and that was all that mattered. She would finish the job, collect her payment, and never come back to this house again. That was the plan. With a deep breath, she made her way back down the darkened hallway, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that clung to the air. Her mind kept racing with thoughts she couldn't control, thoughts of the whispering, the shadows, and the sound of footsteps that had echoed through the house only hours before. She reached the top of the stairs and hesitated, staring down into the inky blackness of the living room below. The house felt heavier now, as if the weight of something unseen was pressing down on her chest. The silence was deafening. She glanced back toward the children's room, half expecting to hear a noise or see one of them standing at the door, asking her to check under their beds again, but the hallway remained still. The house was so quiet now, it was almost oppressive. She had never been so acutely aware of her own breathing, the sound of her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The nerves she had dismissed earlier were back now, stronger than before. There was something wrong with this place, something lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't just the creaking wood or the draft in the hall. No, it was something deeper, something older. She quickly descended the stairs, hoping to find something to distract her. She thought she might make herself some tea, something hot to calm her nerves, but as she stepped into the kitchen, she stopped dead in her tracks. The light was on. The light above the kitchen sink, which she was certain had been off when she walked through the room earlier, was now flickering, casting strange shadows against the walls. Her breath hitched as she looked around the kitchen. Everything appeared in its place, except for one thing. The window above the sink was open, just a crack, enough to let in the cool night air. She could feel the breeze against her skin, a faint reminder that someone, had been here. Her mind spun as she approached the window. She hadn't opened it. She had made sure the house was locked up tight when the parents left. She never touched the windows, always cautious about how the house was secured. So why was it open now? Her stomach twisted as she scanned the room, looking for signs of an intruder. There was no sign of anyone else, no broken glass, no footprints in the dust, but the sense of wrongness in the air was palpable. She stepped closer to the window, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. The breeze outside was colder now, biting at her skin, and she instinctively pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders. She peered out into the night, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything that might explain the feeling of being watched. The street outside was empty, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. There was nothing there. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her thoughts turned back to the children. They were asleep. They had to be safe. She couldn't let herself fall into panic. She had to finish her job. With a reluctant glance back toward the open window, she turned away and made her way into the living room. The TV was still on, its flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. She sank into the couch, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease just a little. At least she thought she could just wait it out. The parents would be home soon enough. But even as the thought crossed her mind, something inside her warned her not to relax too much. Suddenly, the floor creaked above her. She froze. The hair on the back of her neck prickled as she turned her gaze upward. The sound had been faint, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was moving around upstairs. She stood, her pulse racing once more. She couldn't understand it. The kids were in bed. She had checked on them. The parents had said they'd be gone for a couple of hours, and they'd be back by midnight. But the clock on the wall told her it was already past that. Had they returned early? She grabbed her phone and dialed the parents' number, but again, the line went dead before she could hear anything. The quiet was almost suffocating now, and she wasn't sure if she could trust her own senses. Was the house settling, or was there something more to the noises she'd been hearing all night? The creaking from upstairs continued, but now it sounded more like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Her eyes darted to the staircase. The darkened hallway loomed before her, and she felt an overwhelming urge to check on the children, even though she knew it was probably nothing. Just the house playing tricks on her. But something about the footsteps made her uneasy. They were too purposeful, too intentional. And the silence that followed them was deafening. Stepping into the hallway, she crept toward the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The soft sound of the wind rustling outside was the only noise she could hear now, and even that felt distant, like it was coming from another world entirely. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then the faintest sound, a whisper, drifted down from above. She couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was calling her name. Her breath caught in her throat, and she took a hesitant step toward the stairs. She should have turned back. She should have gone straight to the kids, checked the house, but there was something pulling her forward, something she couldn't explain. Her legs moved almost of their own accord, each step on the stairs creaking loudly in the silence. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before her, long and dark, with the door to the children's room at the far end. The whispering continued, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the room. With her heart racing, she moved closer. She wanted to shout, wanted to call out, but her throat was dry. She was frozen, her body moving as if it were not her own. The whispers grew louder, but they weren't calling her name anymore. This time they were saying something else, something much darker. "Don't open the door." The voice was so clear now, so real, that she stopped dead in her tracks. Her hand, which had been reaching for the door to the children's room, hung frozen in the air. What had she heard? Was that real? Her mind screamed for her to run, to turn around and leave, but she couldn't. She had to open the door. The kids were in there. They were asleep just as she had left them. They were safe. But as her hand made contact with the cold door handle, a wave of dread washed over her, so strong that it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. The door seemed to resist her touch as though someone, was on the other side, pressing against it. She hesitated for a moment, the silence of the house pressing down on her. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, she turned the handle. The door creaked open. As the door creaked open, the faint sound of the children's steady breathing filled the silence of the hallway. She peered into the room, the dim light from the nightlight casting long shadows against the walls. The kids were nestled in their beds, their small forms barely visible beneath the covers. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. A brief wave of relief washed over her as she stepped into the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She moved toward the first bed, where the youngest child, a little girl with blonde curls, lay sound asleep, clutching a stuffed bunny to her chest. The peacefulness of the scene almost lulled her into a false sense of calm. She leaned over and gently adjusted the blankets, making sure they were tucked in tightly around the child. The room was so quiet, it felt as if the air had thickened, as if time itself had slowed down. She checked the other bed, where the older boy was lying, his face peaceful, his fingers curled loosely around a small action figure. The room was as she had left it. She stood there for a moment, staring at the children, her mind still racing from the unsettling noises that had echoed through the house. Her heart was still pounding, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The whispering voice had been so clear. "Don't open the door." The words echoed in her mind, and she shivered involuntarily, her gaze flickering toward the closet, the place she hadn't dared to look since she first stepped into the room. It was partly open, just a crack, enough for her to see the deep shadows inside. Her hand clenched around the doorframe, the same feeling of unease washing over her again. She took a slow, measured breath, trying to calm her thoughts. "It's just the house," she told herself. "Just an old house settling. Nothing more." But even as she tried to convince herself, the feeling lingered, like something was waiting in the darkness, watching her. Waiting for her to let her guard down. Her eyes flickered back to the closet. It was hard to resist. She didn't want to look, didn't want to face whatever was hiding in there, but the curiosity gnawed at her. Slowly, she stepped toward the closet, her pulse racing with every movement. The whispering was still in her ears, distant now, but persistent. The door was slightly ajar, its wooden surface scratched, old, like it had been touched countless times by unseen hands. As she reached for the handle, her skin prickled with the awareness of being watched. A cold gust of air swept through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. She flinched, her fingers tightening around the handle, and pulled the door open. The dark space beyond was vast, the shadows swallowing any light that tried to enter. She couldn't see anything inside. It was empty. Just the bare closet, lined with shelves, a few clothes hanging neatly in place. Yet something felt off. Something wasn't right. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and stepped back from the closet, trying to steady her breathing. She had to focus. She couldn't let fear take control. The kids were fine. The house was just old, that's all. But then, something caught her eye. A small object, barely visible on the floor at the back of the closet. Her breath hitched in her chest as she crouched down, trying to make out what it was. It looked like a tiny, broken piece of something. A shard of glass, perhaps. But as she reached for it, her fingers brushed against something far colder than the rest of the room. Her heart lurched in her chest and she froze. There, among the clothes, a faint, pale handprint was etched into the closet wall. The edges of the print were smudged, as if it had been made by something, or someone. Wet, the handprint almost alive in its own way. It was unmistakable. It wasn't hers. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the handprint, her mind racing. It couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, or her imagination running wild. But even as she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't deny the feeling of cold dread that gripped her. The walls of the house seemed to close in on her, the air thick with the sense of something malevolent lurking just out of sight. "Think," she told herself. "Stay calm." But her body wasn't listening. She stood up quickly, her pulse racing, and took a step back from the closet. The handprint didn't fade. It was still there, as if it was waiting for her to acknowledge it, to understand it. The whispering began again, louder this time, and for a brief moment, it sounded like it was coming from the closet itself. Her stomach twisted with fear, and she turned, nearly running out of the room. She had to get out. She had to get to the kids, make sure they were okay, But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the closet, as though something was about to reach out and grab her. As her back hit the doorframe, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of the room. Her eyes snapped toward it, and her breath hitched. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift. No, not the shadows. Something was there, something that hadn't been there before. Something dark, crouched and still, watching her. She blinked, and the figure was gone. There was nothing but the corner of the room, still and empty. She exhaled sharply, trying to calm the wild beating of her heart. She was imagining things. She had to be. It was the fear, the tension building in her chest, making her see things that weren't there. But that didn't stop the terror that crawled under her skin. She didn't want to be in this house anymore. She didn't want to be alone in the silence, hearing things that shouldn't be there. With shaking hands, she grabbed her phone again, determined to call the parents this time, to make sure they were on their way back, to tell them that something was wrong. But as she pressed the screen to dial, the screen flickered, and the phone went dead again. She looked at it in disbelief, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Why won't it work? She tried again. Nothing. The screen stayed dark, unresponsive, as if mocking her desperation. She let out a soft, frustrated cry, her hand tightening around the phone before she shoved it back into her pocket. Her mind spun. Get out. Call for help. The urge to flee was overwhelming. But she couldn't. She couldn't leave the kids behind. They were asleep, trusting her to keep them safe. She was their only protection. The house felt colder now, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows in every corner moving like they were alive, watching her, waiting. The whispering grew louder again, no longer distant but right behind her, in her ear, soft and insistent. Get out, it breathed. They're not alone. Her blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It wasn't coming from anywhere she could see. It was inside her head, inside her very thoughts, gnawing at her mind. They're not alone. She turned slowly, her eyes wide in fear, scanning the room once more. The children were still asleep, just as they had been moments ago. But the house had changed. The air had thickened. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. And somewhere, hidden in the dark, something was moving. Something was waiting. The floor creaked behind her, louder this time, closer. She spun around, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive stillness of the house. Her breath quickened as her mind screamed at her to move, to get out, to run. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she figured out what was happening. Her eyes locked on the window. The faint moonlight outside barely cut through the darkness, casting strange patterns on the floor. A shadow flickered in the corner of the glass, just a flicker, but unmistakable. Something, or someone, was on the other side. She rushed toward the window, her heart racing, and pulled the blinds up quickly, expecting to see something terrifying, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark street, the stillness of the night. Yet the feeling remained. Something was wrong. Something was in the house. And it was getting closer. The air in the room seemed to thicken with every passing second, and as she stood by the window, the oppressive silence enveloped her. She had hoped that by looking outside, the chill creeping down her spine would dissipate, but instead, it only grew stronger, almost as if the world beyond the glass was as empty as the house she was in. The street outside, usually a busy thoroughfare, was silent, and the glow from the distant streetlights cast long, ghostly shadows against the pavement. It should have been a relief to see nothing. The emptiness outside matched the void inside, but it only intensified the strange sensation that she was being watched. Her heart was still pounding as she slowly lowered the blinds, the soft rattle of the mechanism adding an unsettling layer of noise to the otherwise perfect stillness. She turned back to the room, her gaze sweeping over the space as though expecting to find something, or someone, standing in the corners. Nothing. Only the dim light of the nightlight illuminated the two sleeping children, their tiny forms still and serene under their blankets. The peacefulness of their slumber contrasted sharply with the turmoil that churned within her. She had been trying so hard to convince herself that everything was fine, that this was just an old house playing tricks on her mind, but she could no longer deny the gnawing fear that had settled in her gut. The whispering voice, the shadows in the corners of the room, the cold gusts of air that seemed to appear out of nowhere, all of it was too much. The house was alive in a way she couldn't explain. It had a presence. She could feel it. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Her eyes drifted back to the closet, the faint crack in the door still visible, beckoning her. She had checked it earlier, convinced herself it was nothing, just an old closet with clothes hanging inside, but now, the sight of it seemed to stir something deep within her. The handprint she had found, the strange coldness of the closet, and the whispering voice, it was all connected. Her thoughts swirled in a tangled mess, fear and curiosity warring within her. Part of her screamed to run, to get out of the house, but another part, the part that was determined to make it through the night, wanted to understand what was happening. The soft breathing of the children in the room seemed to reassure her, grounding her in reality. They were safe. They were asleep. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something she couldn't stop. She turned away from the closet, her body tense, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The house was quiet again, too quiet. There was no noise, no creaks or groans from the walls. Just stillness. But that silence was the worst part. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on her, suffocating her with its weight. She couldn't take it anymore. She needed to check on the kids, make sure they were still safe, that they hadn't woken up to the strange sounds that filled the house. But when she turned toward the door, her footstep faltered. The sound came again, the same soft creak she had heard earlier, but this time it was closer. Much closer. It was coming from the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood perfectly still, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing in the stillness of the house. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. The steps were too precise, too purposeful, to be anything but someone, or something, walking toward her. Her breath caught in her throat as she instinctively took a step back. She wanted to call out, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her, leaving her throat dry and tight. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the door. She could feel the presence on the other side, like someone, was standing just beyond the threshold, waiting for her to make a move. For a moment, everything was suspended in time. The world outside the door seemed to vanish, and there was only the oppressive weight of the moment pressing in on her. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, her heart hammering in her chest, but it felt like an eternity. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she reached for the door handle, her hand shaking violently as she twisted it. As the door swung open, her mind screamed for her to look away, to shut the door and run, but her body moved without her control, her eyes widening as she stepped into the hallway. The house seemed to expand before her, the hallway stretching farther than she remembered. Shadows clung to the walls, distorting the light from the dim bulb overhead, making the place seem even darker than it should have been. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it were filled with something foul. She couldn't see anyone, but the sound of breathing was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was just around the corner. She could hear the shallow, ragged breaths, each one more labored than the last, like a person trying to keep quiet, trying to hide. But it was impossible to ignore. Her pulse was deafening in her ears as she stepped forward, her feet moving almost of their own accord. The hallway seemed to grow longer with every step she took, and yet, she couldn't stop herself from walking toward the sound. She could feel the coldness in the air now, biting at her skin, and it was growing colder with every passing moment. The door to the living room was slightly ajar, and she could see the faint flicker of the TV in the next room. The footsteps had stopped. She paused, standing at the threshold of the living room, listening. The air in here felt different, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees since she had last been in the room. There was something about the stillness that made her skin crawl. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to move, to make the next move. The oppressive silence weighed on her, suffocating her, and yet she couldn't leave. She couldn't just walk away. The children needed her. With a quiet sigh, she pushed open the door and stepped into the living room. Her eyes scanned the space, but everything appeared normal. The couch, the coffee table, the TV, everything was in its place. But something felt off. The air was so thick, it was like she could almost taste it. Her breath seemed to catch in her throat as she looked around, trying to make sense of the feeling that was creeping up on her. The lights flickered. Once, twice. And then the temperature dropped. She could see her breath in the air, a fog forming with every exhale. She turned quickly, her heart leaping in her chest, and found the window, slightly ajar. She had locked it earlier. She was sure of it. The moment her eyes landed on the window, the sense of dread returned tenfold. Someone had opened it, and that someone was still in the house. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she stepped toward the window, her hand reaching for the latch, her mind working frantically to make sense of the situation. There was no way to explain what was happening, no logical reason for any of this. But she couldn't ignore the signs, the whispers, the cold, the footsteps. The house was not empty. The sound came again. A faint scraping noise, like fingernails against the floor, dragging across the wood. Her breath hitched, and she spun around, her eyes wide in panic. Her feet froze, her body stiff with fear. From the corner of the living room, she saw something moving. Something large. Something shadowy. She couldn't make out the details, but the figure was there. It was standing just beyond the doorway, its shape distorted by the flickering light from the television. Her body refused to move. The figure stepped forward, and in that moment she saw it, the darkness in the shape of a person, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, staring back at her. The figure in the doorway loomed larger with each passing second, its shape becoming more defined as the light from the television flickered erratically, casting long, sharp shadows across the walls. She couldn't move. Her feet felt like they were glued to the floor, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, to leave this nightmare behind, but her limbs were frozen, her mind overwhelmed by the horrifying sight before her. It wasn't human. At least, not in any way she could understand. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with long, sinewy arms that hung at its sides like they didn't belong. Its skin, if it could even be called that, was stretched thin, pale and translucent, almost shimmering in the dim light. The eyes, those eyes, were hollow and empty, dark pits that seemed to pull in all the light around them, as though they could devour the very essence of the room. And the grin. The grin stretched unnaturally wide across its face, too wide, like it had been carved there with malice, the teeth sharp and jagged, yellowed with age. There was no mistaking the intent in those eyes, the malicious hunger that seemed to radiate off of it. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reverberating in her ears as the creature took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath its weight, the sound sharp and loud in the otherwise silent room. It didn't make a sound as it moved, no scraping or dragging of feet, just the subtle shift of the air around it. A chill followed in its wake, a bone-deep cold that seemed to seep into her very soul. The room seemed to darken around her, the walls closing in, the space shrinking as if the house itself was contracting with the presence of whatever this thing was. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. It can't be real. It can't be real. But the more she stared at it, the more real it became. There was no mistaking it. This thing, this creature, was here in the room with her, and it was getting closer. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, but they were still locked in place, as though her body itself refused to move, paralyzed by fear. With every step the creature took, the temperature dropped further, until she could see her breath hanging in the air like smoke. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Her lungs burned with each inhale, and she felt as if the very air in the room was thickening, becoming dense and unbreathable. The thing took another step. And then another. It was so close now that she could feel the cold radiating off of it, like a blast of ice, crawling across her skin, numbing her fingertips. Her mind screamed at her to scream, to shout, to call for help, but her throat was dry, the words caught somewhere deep inside. What do I do? What do I do? Her eyes darted to the door, but it seemed so far away now. The living room stretched before her, a vast, empty space between her and escape. She knew she couldn't outrun it. She couldn't even move. The creature's hollow eyes seemed to follow her, its grin widening further, if that was even possible. The darkness that clung to it seemed to grow, to shift, to swirl in unnatural ways, as if it was part of the very fabric of the house itself. It was here for a reason. But what was it? Why was it here? Her mind raced with questions, but they felt irrelevant now, drowned out by the overwhelming presence of the thing before her. Then it spoke. The voice was low, distorted, as if it came from the depths of the earth itself, reverberating in her skull. It was almost a whisper, but the words were clear enough. You shouldn't have opened the door. The sound of its voice sent a ripple of terror through her entire body, the words dripping with malice, as though it knew everything about her, knew her every fear and weakness. The door? The door. The words didn't make sense, but they didn't need to. The voice wasn't meant to be understood. It was meant to unnerve, to distort her sense of reality. Her hands trembled at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep herself from collapsing. She had to stay conscious. She had to stay aware. The kids were still upstairs, asleep. She had to protect them. That was her job, her responsibility. But in that moment, it was hard to remember anything but the dark figure in front of her, its twisted grin stretching impossibly wide, its eyes boring into her soul. She couldn't escape it. It was in her head, in her thoughts, feeding off her fear. She could feel it, growing stronger with every breath, every second she stood there, paralyzed in place. The thing took another step, closing the gap between them, and she finally snapped out of her stupor. She couldn't just stand here. She couldn't. The children needed her. She had to protect them. She had to get to them. But when she tried to move, her body wouldn't respond. Her legs were like lead, heavy and uncooperative. The cold was unbearable now, each breath like shards of ice stabbing into her chest. Her head spun, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. But the thing in front of her wasn't going to let her. It was feeding off her fear, using it to keep her trapped, to keep her still. She tried again, harder this time. Her legs buckled beneath her, but she pushed herself up, her hand gripping the edge of the coffee table for support. She had to get to the stairs. She had to get to the kids. But as she took a step forward, the figure lunged. In an instant, it was right in front of her, its cold, skeletal hand reaching out, its nails impossibly long and sharp. She stumbled backward, her heart racing as the creature's grip closed around her wrist. Its touch was icy, colder than anything she had ever felt, as if it was draining the warmth from her very bones. The creature's grin grew wider, its mouth opening impossibly wide as it leaned in, its breath rancid and foul, like the stench of decay. And then, with a voice that sounded like the rasp of dead leaves scraping against the ground, it whispered directly into her ear, "They are already lost." She gasped, the words cutting through her like a blade. She refused to believe it. She couldn't believe it. The children. They were still safe. They had to be. She wasn't going to let this thing take them. With a final surge of adrenaline, she ripped her arm free from its grip, stumbling backward and falling to the floor. She didn't know how, but she forced herself up, her mind focused on one thing: the children. The kids were upstairs. She had to get to them. Her legs shook, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The creature, however, wasn't finished with her yet. It followed her, its movements smooth and fluid, its form shifting with the shadows, as though it was made of darkness itself. It was faster now, closing in on her as she made her way toward the stairs. Her eyes were wide with terror as she reached the bottom step, but just as she lifted her foot to take the first step up, the creature grabbed her ankle. She screamed, the sound tearing through the silence, but it was swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the house. The creature yanked her back, its grip unrelenting. The cold burned against her skin as it dragged her closer, its face contorting with an almost gleeful malice. But just before it could pull her further, the sound of a door slamming open echoed from upstairs, sharp and sudden. The creature froze. It looked toward the stairs, its dark eyes narrowing, as though it was aware of something, someone, approaching. And for just a split second, it hesitated. But that hesitation was all she needed. The hesitation didn't last long. It was just a fleeting moment, but in that instant, something inside her snapped. A surge of primal instinct flooded through her, and before she could stop herself, she twisted violently, breaking free from the creature's iron grip. She didn't look back, couldn't look back. Every cell in her body screamed at her to move, to get away. The cold hands of the creature seemed to still cling to the edges of her being, an icy residue left behind as if it had marked her. But she didn't care. Her feet barely touched the floor as she scrambled toward the stairs, pulling herself up each step with the desperate urgency of someone who knew she was running out of time. The creature, however, wasn't far behind. She could hear it moving, hear the dragging, scraping sound of its limbs across the floor as it followed her. The house seemed to bend around her as she moved, the walls narrowing, the air thickening, as though it too were aware of the danger that followed her. Each step was an agonizing effort, her legs trembling beneath her as she tried to push herself higher, to get to the kids, to get to safety. The stairwell seemed endless, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the weight of the creature's presence was pulling her back down. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps, her chest aching as she reached the landing at the top. The door to the children's room was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. She barely noticed the dim glow. Her eyes were focused solely on the path ahead, the sound of the creature growing louder, closer, like a dark wave crashing down on her. With a frantic push, she burst through the door to the children's room, the cool air of the hallway rushing in behind her. The room felt like a sanctuary, a place of safety, but she knew that it wasn't. Nothing in this house was safe anymore. The kids were still asleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding just beyond the door. The younger girl lay curled up under her blanket, the stuffed bunny still clutched tightly in her arms. The boy, older but still small, was tucked beneath the covers, his breathing steady and rhythmic. They looked so innocent, so fragile, and the overwhelming protectiveness she felt for them nearly choked her. But she didn't have time to comfort them. She didn't have time to check if they were truly okay. The creature was closing in on her, its presence undeniable now. There was no more pretending, no more thinking she could run away from this. The house had swallowed them whole, and whatever this thing was, it was the reason why. With her heart pounding, she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, her eyes scanning the space for something, anything, that could help. The closet. The window. She didn't know where to go, what to do, but she knew she couldn't stay here. The thing was too close now. It was almost upon her. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as if the house itself were trying to squeeze her out. The familiar comforting objects in the room, the nightlight, the toy boxes, the little paintings on the walls, suddenly seemed alien, warped by the growing terror that clawed at her. Every shadow seemed to dance with malevolent intent. The quiet hum of the house, the stillness that had once felt so serene, was now suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. The darkness in the corners of the room was thick, as if it were alive, moving. She stumbled back from the door, her mind racing for an escape, for a way to get out, to protect the children. The coldness from the hallway seeped in through the doorframe, a whisper of ice that made her skin crawl. She could still feel the thing's presence behind her, hear it just beyond the threshold, its breath labored, like it was waiting for her to make a mistake. It was toying with her. Focus, she thought. You can't panic. The kids need you. But it was hard to think clearly. The room seemed to spin, the shadows deepening, the air growing heavier with every second. She turned to the kids, her eyes landing on the little girl first. She was so still, her tiny chest rising and falling in the softest rhythm. The boy, too, was motionless, his face serene in the glow of the nightlight. They didn't deserve any of this. She had promised to protect them, to keep them safe, and now here she was, failing them. The door behind her groaned, the unmistakable sound of something pressing against it. She froze. The creature was right there, pushing against the door, the handle rattling as if it were going to break through at any moment. Her breath hitched, her fingers trembling as she turned to look at the children, her heart in her throat. They were still so unaware of the nightmare inching closer to them. She had to act quickly. Without thinking, she rushed over to the window. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged within her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed to think. She needed a plan. The closet. There's a closet in the corner. Her eyes darted to it. It was small, not much of a hiding place, but it might buy them some time. If she could just get the kids in there, they could hide and she could figure something out. The window wouldn't open fast enough. The door was being battered from the other side. Time was running out. She moved quickly, shaking the little girl awake first. The girl blinked up at her, eyes wide, confused, but she didn't scream. Not yet. The shock of the situation had rendered her speechless. The boy, however, stirred less easily. He groaned softly, his small hands tugging at the blanket around him. She had no time for soft words or explanations. She lifted him from the bed, pulling both kids into the corner of the room, toward the closet. The door rattled harder now, and she knew that it was only a matter of moments before the creature would break through. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice shaking. The words felt hollow, almost futile in the face of what was happening, but they were all she had. She shoved the children into the closet, her hands trembling as she pressed them into the corner, pulling the door shut behind them. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only one she had. As she closed the door, a sense of terror swept over her, a deep, gnawing fear that she had just made the worst mistake of her life. She wasn't sure what she was doing anymore. The kids were safe, hidden, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't. The creature was still out there. It was coming for them. For all of them. With the closet door shut and the children huddled inside, she backed away slowly, her eyes flickering to the window again. She knew she couldn't leave them behind. The thought of running felt like betrayal, but at the same time, staying felt like a death sentence for all of them. The house seemed to hold its breath as the door continued to rattle. The creature outside was getting closer. It was almost there. She turned toward the door, her fingers trembling as she grasped the handle. One last time, she tried to open it, but it was no use. The door was held fast, the creature's force pressing against it from the other side. With a deep breath, she steadied herself and turned toward the window again, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. It was the only option left. With her heart in her throat, she moved to the window and grabbed the latch once more. This time, it opened with a soft click, the cool night air flooding into the room. She pushed the window open as wide as she could, but the sound of the door splitting under the creature's pressure was now deafening. She didn't know what to do. What could she do? The kids were in the closet. The window was open. The door was about to give way. There was only one choice left. She leapt toward the window, pushing herself out into the cold night, desperate for the first breath of freedom. The night air hit her face like a slap, cold and sharp as she tumbled out of the window and into the yard below. She barely registered the impact with the ground. Her body was still in survival mode, adrenaline coursing through her veins, forcing her to move, to keep running, to not look back. Her legs were weak, her mind clouded with terror, but she had to keep going. The children were still upstairs, still in the house, and she had just left them behind. The guilt gnawed at her, but there was no time to dwell on it. Not yet. She stumbled to her feet, the gravel beneath her boots sharp and unforgiving, but she didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. The house loomed behind her, dark and foreboding, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the moon. It felt like the world around her was closing in, pressing down on her, pushing her toward a fate she couldn't outrun. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and the shadows cast by the trees in the yard seemed to stretch, growing longer and darker with every step she took. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. What do I do? She had no plan. She had no idea where to go or what to do next. The house was still there, and the children were still inside. She had to go back. She had to get them out. But the thought of re-entering that house, the thought of facing that thing again, made her insides twist with fear. What if it was already inside the closet with them? What if it was waiting for her to make a mistake, to think she could escape? She pushed those thoughts aside. Focus. She couldn't help the children if she froze up. She couldn't help them if she gave in to the terror, so she forced herself to keep moving, toward the gate that separated the yard from the road. The house was still behind her, its windows dark and lifeless, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting for her to turn around. Every instinct told her to keep running, to keep moving, but a part of her, a sick part, told her to go back. She reached the gate and threw it open, not sparing a second to look back. The road beyond the yard was dark, and the streetlights flickered like dying stars. There was no one out here, no one who could help her. She was alone. But she wasn't just alone. She was being hunted. Whatever that thing was, it had followed her. She could feel it, like an icy breath on the back of her neck, the weight of its presence pushing down on her chest. She didn't know what it wanted, but she knew it wasn't finished with her. The road stretched out before her, a dark and empty ribbon, but it was the only escape. She started walking faster, her steps faltering, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let it catch up to her. She had no idea where she was going, no idea what she was hoping for, but she had to keep moving. She had to get away. As the minutes passed, her mind started to clear, and she forced herself to focus. The phone. The phone. She pulled it out of her pocket, her fingers shaking so violently she almost dropped it. It was still dead, of course, still unresponsive. She tried it again, but the screen stayed black, a mocking reminder of how powerless she was. Her breath caught in her throat as she shoved the phone back into her pocket. She needed help. She needed someone to come and help her, but there was no one. She was on her own. The thought settled heavily in her chest, making it harder to breathe. No one was coming for her. The further she walked, the more isolated the world around her felt. The street was empty, the trees lining the road tall and silent, like they were watching her, like they knew she was in danger. The wind rustled through the branches above her, but there was no other sound. The world felt suffocatingly still, like everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She pushed forward, her steps becoming more frantic as the fear rose within her. Her heart beat so loud in her chest she could hear nothing else. The cold air bit at her skin, making her shiver, but she didn't care. She had to keep going. But then she heard it again. The faintest sound. A scrape. A shuffle. Her breath caught in her throat. She froze, her body locking in place as she strained to listen. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat. No, it can't be. It can't be following me. It can't be real. But the sound was real. She could hear it behind her, just at the edge of her hearing. She couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched, hunted, was impossible to ignore. The darkness around her seemed to grow deeper, thicker, pressing in from all sides. She turned quickly, scanning the road behind her, but it was empty. There was nothing there. Nothing but the dark, empty street. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. It's just the wind. It's just your imagination. But then the sound came again. Closer this time. A shuffling, scraping noise. Her body tensed, her eyes darting to the shadows lining the road. The footsteps were real. They were following her, but they were still too far behind. For a split second, she almost felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she could outrun it. Maybe she could escape. But the hope was fleeting. The shadows seemed to shift around her, twisting and moving like they had a life of their own. She couldn't make sense of it. The night was too still, too silent, and yet it was like something was stirring in the darkness, moving just beyond her sight. The scraping continued, growing louder with every step she took. She broke into a run. Her legs felt like lead as she pushed herself harder, faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wasn't thinking. She didn't have time to think. She just had to move, had to escape, had to get away from whatever was following her. But the more she ran, the more the sounds followed. They were closer now, the scraping of feet on gravel, the soft padding of footsteps that echoed in her mind, growing louder, closer, faster. Every time she thought she was outrunning it, the noise grew nearer. It wasn't just following her. It was gaining on her. Her pulse was deafening, her ears filled with the sound of her own frantic breathing as the road stretched on ahead. But every shadow, every movement in the corner of her eye, felt like it was reaching for her. It was like the road itself had become a trap, an endless stretch of pavement that had no end. She was running in circles, her panic blinding her to the reality of her situation. She couldn't keep running. Her body was starting to give out. Her legs burned with exhaustion, her chest ached with every breath. She had to find somewhere to hide, somewhere to make the sounds stop, somewhere to stop running. But the road was endless. And then she saw it. A figure. It was standing at the end of the street, just barely visible in the distance. A tall, dark silhouette against the night. Her breath caught in her throat, a sickening chill crawling down her spine. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching her, waiting. The thing. It was waiting for her to reach the end of the road. To make the final mistake. Her heart slammed in her chest as she realized the truth. There was no escape. There was no running. She wasn't meant to leave this place. The road had always been a trap. And now she was caught. The figure at the end of the road stood motionless, a silhouette so dark it seemed to absorb the faint light from the distant street lamps, its shape almost too unnatural to comprehend. As she took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest, the realization hit her like a physical blow. This was it. This was what had been chasing her, the source of everything. The coldness, the footsteps, the shadows that clung to her like a second skin. It had found her. There was nowhere left to run. Her breath caught in her throat as the creature's form began to shift, moving slowly, deliberately, as though savoring every moment of her terror. Each step it took seemed to stretch the distance between them, making the ground beneath her feet feel heavier, like it was sucking her in, holding her down. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, as though the weight of the situation had anchored her to the spot. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. The air around her felt suffocating, thick with an oppressive force that crushed her ribs, making every breath a struggle. It was closer now, just a few feet away, its presence overwhelming in its intensity. The darkness around it seemed to ripple, like it wasn't just a part of the night but something deeper, something older, pulling at the very fabric of reality. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate, a low, almost inaudible hum that resonated through her bones. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she wondered if she was still awake or if she had slipped into some kind of fever dream, her mind playing tricks on her. But no, she knew it was real. Every fiber of her being screamed that this was real, that there was nothing left to stop it. The creature moved again, its long, gangly arms stretching toward her with unnatural speed. Its fingers, thin and spindly, like long, brittle claws, reached for her, their tips glinting in the dim light. She could feel the air shift, the temperature dropping even further, a bitter cold that wrapped around her like an icy embrace. Her hands shook violently, but she couldn't pull them away. The creature's gaze, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto hers, its grin widening, stretching impossibly wide, as if it reveled in her fear. "You should have never come back," it whispered, the voice scraping across her ears like 1,000 whispers in a forgotten language, too guttural to understand, yet somehow she knew what it meant. It wasn't speaking in words, it was speaking in pure, unfiltered terror, using her own fear against her, making her doubt her very existence. She stumbled backward, her heart beating so loudly now that she couldn't hear anything else. No, this can't be happening. This can't be real. But the creature's grip on reality was stronger than hers. The world around her seemed to shift, the road warping and bending as though the ground itself was alive, distorting in response to the creature's presence. Her legs finally gave way, and she collapsed to the ground, her knees scraping the gravel beneath her. She didn't have the strength to get back up. Her body trembled uncontrollably as she pressed her palms into the ground, trying to steady herself, but the vibrations in the earth only grew stronger, like some deep, unseen force was trying to pull her into the depths. The shadows seemed to stretch out from all around her, curling in on her, coiling like serpents, wrapping around her legs, her arms, pulling her closer to the creature, dragging her toward the thing that waited in the darkness. The air was thick with dread, and the shadows seemed to have a life of their own, shifting and stretching as if they could reach out and take her at any moment. She tried to move, tried to pull herself free, but it felt as though the world was closing in around her, tightening with each passing second. Her chest tightened and she gasped for air, but it was as though the very atmosphere had thickened, pressing down on her from all sides. And then it spoke again. The voice was low, but it filled her entire being, vibrating in her bones. "You should have stayed away. it crooned, each word dripping with malice, as though it was savoring every syllable. "This place was never meant to let you leave. And now you're mine." The words hung in the air, lingering like smoke, their meaning sinking deep into her mind. She felt a surge of panic, but it was suffocated by a strange sense of helplessness, as if every ounce of energy she had left had been drained from her. The creature was right. It had one. There was no escape. The house, the road, the very air around her, all of it had been twisted into a cage, and she was the prisoner, the prey, trapped in its unrelenting grip. The ground beneath her shifted again, and this time, it wasn't just vibrations. It was as if the earth itself had cracked open, splitting wide to reveal something even darker beneath. From the cracks in the road, shadows poured out like liquid, pooling around her, seeping into her skin, wrapping around her soul. She could feel it. It's not just the creature. It's the house. It's everything. The house is alive. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. The house. The house was never empty. The creature's grin twisted further, impossibly wide, as if it could feel her mind unraveling. It was feeding off her fear, and she could feel it, her terror, her despair, everything she had buried deep inside, pouring out of her, flowing into the thing that was standing before her. It was pulling at her, draining her, becoming a part of her. The house wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it was hungry. She tried to scream, but the words were stolen from her lips, trapped in her throat. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, only the low hum of the creature's presence, vibrating in the air around her. It reached forward, its clawed hand hovering just inches from her face, and she could feel the cold radiating off of it, the icy touch of death itself. A jolt of energy shot through her, and for a split second she could move. She scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the gravel, but it was too late. The creature lunged, its long fingers wrapping around her throat with terrifying speed, squeezing tightly, choking the air from her lungs. Her vision blurred, the world spinning as she struggled for breath, but the creature's grip tightened, and the darkness closed in around her. Her mind screamed for help, but there was no one. No one could help her. No one could hear her. She was alone. The creature's laugh was like nails on a chalkboard, grating and deep, reverberating in her skull. "There is no escape," it whispered, its voice a low hiss. "You were never meant to leave." And with that, the darkness swallowed her whole.